G'day, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie, and today we're getting mindful about men's mental health and patriarchy. Now, trigger warning because we will be talking about mental health, that if you do get triggered by discussions around mental health or mental illness, feel free to skip this episode. That's okay. But if you do stick around and you do get triggered, please reach out to your support networks afterwards. And today, joining me, I've got Kyle Hamer from Vancouver, Canada. How you going, Kyle?
I'm doing very well. Excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have been for a little while. Now, Kyle, you're a community builder with Man Becoming. Tell us a
Correct.
bit about what Man Becoming is before we get started into the show.
Yeah, so it literally started as an idea. I had joined a brotherhood, a local brotherhood here in Vancouver. I was in it for about 18 months, year and a half. And that was kind of my first foray into the space of men's work. And what happened, like the more I kind of got into it, and then, Mr. Google over there, I realized that there was this thing of whenever you type in anything to do with like being a man, there's pages and pages and pages of how to be a man. And I thought this is insane. Like, can you imagine? Like it seems comical when you reverse the script and you go, can you imagine pages of like how to be a woman?
No.
Right? It just doesn't happen. So I was like, wow, there's like we talk about like the male identity crisis that we're kind of having. And this was like the spotlight for me.
Mm.
And so I got into men's work through the brotherhood and I just kind of went down the rabbit hole and man becoming as a name, as an idea was this idea that everything else is like how to become a man. And I was like, what if we reverse that script and said, we are men. We don't need to do anything to qualify as a man. Like we are men by choice or otherwise. I don't care. If you choose, if that's your, chosen gender, great. But we don't have to qualify being a man. And the becoming part isn't about becoming a man. It's about first we accept that we are a man, then we can become the man that we want to become. And for me, I do that through community.
Wonderful. I love this concept. I was on another podcast this morning before we jumped online together, and I was talking about growing up in the 80s and 90s in northern suburbs of Adelaide, so a very working class area, cross between working class and a lot of pockets of welfare as well. And in the 80s and 90s, like the only idea I had about the world and what it meant to be a man was essentially the people around me. So my dad and my three brothers and the people I went to school with and the people that I played sports with. So particularly Australian rules footy. And we had three channels on the TV. That was it. And it was very much you had a TV guide and you knew what you were going to watch during the day. There was no choice aside from you choosing not to watch the TV, and you had your two or three radio stations, but that was it. And so this idea of what it meant to be a man in the 80s and 90s was very much driven, in particular my environment, was that yeah, boys become men by being tough and masculine and strong, and they don't talk about emotions. And interestingly enough, like when I was in primary school, I remember my friend, he was crying in the schoolyard, and I went into this automatic boys don't cry. So I went up to him and said, mate, you've got to stop crying. Boys don't cry. And he said, Simon, I can cry if I want to. And it really shook my world. It planted a seed in my mind that maybe everything I've been learning about what it meant to be a man was not true. And that stuck with me ever since. And it's kind of driving me with mindful men, like how we can be mindful of who we are and how we can grow. And it sounds like in a very similar way to man becoming. So I really love this concept, and particularly around community building, because we're in a nomadic world these days. A lot of guys that I know around Sunshine Coast where I live, they've moved interstate a few times. Like I've been in four different Australian states, and this is not where I grew up. And a lot of guys do fly in, fly out work to mines and all
Yeah.
sorts of stuff. So that sense of community has essentially disappeared for a lot of guys, particularly. And I think maybe that's why they're all Googling, how do you become a man? How do you connect with community? How do you make friendships and stuff like that?
Well, Yeah, it's so systemic. I mean, it's, you can literally go through school nowadays. I think in our generation it wasn't as common, but now you can go through your entire K to 12 education and never have a male teacher.
Hmm.
And then if you don't have a dad at home, and if you didn't play sports, the odds of you never having a male role model of any kind is huge. It's very
Yeah.
likely, actually. And it's interesting when you described your, where you're from and where you grew up, because as you were saying that, I'm like, small town, yeah, industrial, yeah. Like every, the three channels I called it farmer vision.
Hmm.
Um, it was three channels, two of them were the same, more or less. So it's just like which one comes in clearer on this day.
Yeah.
Because it was like antenna. It wasn't even like, clear
Yeah.
TV. It was,
I had a TV that you just have to pull the dial out and then it would turn on. Like
yeah, I
no,
know the
no,
ones. Yeah,
not a
yeah,
remote or anything like that.
yeah. We had the ones encased in the
Yeah.
wood frame. But yeah, I grew up in a town of, at the time, I think it was actually maybe even bigger then than it is now, but it was, around 20,000 people. I think we actually had the largest logging sector in North America. We were a logging town through and through, but we were also a mining town, and we had peripheral to the oil industry. So there's a lot of people traveling in and out for oil as well. So very resource based town.
Hmm.
Um, and everything in the town was based off the resource money, right? Like that was what made the town tick.
Mm.
And like you said, it was a lot of middle class and a lot of welfare. There was not much in between, and there was not a lot of extreme. And I'll tell you a little story, because I remember that first moment for you, like that, where you were saying that he was like, I can cry if I want to. For me, it was, I hated school. I was very good in school. School was easy for me. Like the learning part was easy for me. I was like a magnet to it. But it was the before school, recess, lunch hour, after school. I hated it. It was a nightmare because that meant that I had to fend for myself. It was very isolating. So my experience of kind of that idea of like manhood was, I grew up fishing and camping. Fishing, camping, hunting, like that was what we did. And I loved it when we went out hunting with the guys, but it was the first time where the guys, the dads were just like, at the age of like 10 years old, they're like, well, when you're with us, you're men, and
Mm.
what happens in the bush stays in the bush, and you can swear, you can curse, the moms will never know. And I remember that feeling, like there was definitely that sense of like, oh, I feel respected.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but it's funny because I remember the first time I ever kind of put that mask on myself was on a hunting trip, and I ended up shooting a moose. And it was the first time I'd ever done that. I've shot birds and whatever, but it was the first time I'd ever shot a moose, anything big. And I remember it was like the adrenaline pumping, I'm shaking. But as soon as it fell, there was this massive sense of sadness and grief
Hmm.
in me. And at the same time, I think it was probably to this day the most proud my dad has ever been of me.
Wow.
So it put me in this such a paradox of, here's my dad celebrating me, and I feel so bad for what I just did, you
Yeah.
know? And I remember that was the first time where it was just like, it was kind of like that. All right, I'm just going to pretend to be super happy about it and not let that sadness show. And just, it was everything for my dad in that moment. So
Did you go hunting again after that? Like, did you keep hunting?
I did for a couple more years, but I think I got the moose when I was around 15 or something. So I was right in that age where, I started getting a job, and I didn't necessarily go out with them as much. And by the time I was 18, I was out of hunting, and now I'm in the city, and my idea of going hunting would be to shooting anything would be to take a camera.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
I just don't have a desire.
Yeah. It's interesting, like when you're a dad, like the things in different parts of our time that make you proud as a parent. The one that sticks out for me, for my, because I've got a son who's 5.5, and was the first time he just stood up to do a wee.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't even compare into shooting a moose. But I think it's also, maybe it's a period of time that's different. It's also the activities you're doing. I guess like for me, it's a life milestone for my son to stand up and go to the toilet.
Hmm.
For a 15-year-old or so, almost like a rites of passage
Yeah.
type thing. And I think a lot of guys would go through that as well. Like in Australia, the rites of passage are more like drinking at 16. And so we can legally drink at 18. So, but you generally start at 16, and particularly in my social circles, and getting drunk, and how bad can you write yourself off, essentially?
And that was the other side of my town. Like when I wasn't, going out hunting or fishing, by the time I hit that 16 mark, it was, like I said, it was a lot less of the outdoorsy, and it was a alcohol
Mm.
fueled rager from the time I was, I mean, I didn't do it frequently when I was 16, but that's when it started. Um, go camping with friends and just buy like a bottle of 151 proof rum, and
Mm.
because we're like, oh, this is $20 and it'll get all of us drunk like for multiple days. Just smelling the bottle, and you're like, oh, but yeah, from the time I was 16 till I was probably 26, it was like a decade of, just that was the thing, was you just go and get absolutely smashed.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, like the schoolyard, and like outside of the classroom, and you had to kind of essentially be the man yourself. And can you describe a bit about what some of the things that you went through in the schoolyard?
I used to say that I was bullied, but in truth, I wasn't. Like I was teased a little bit. Mostly it was isolation. I desperately wanted to belong. I desperately wanted to have friends, as every kid does. And I just remember thinking at times that I was like, man, I wish I was invisible, because at least
Mhm.
then people would have an excuse not to see me. I don't know what hurt more, the teasing or not being seen. And I think at the end of the day, not being seen. Because at
Mm.
least when you're seen and you're being teased, you get angry. You can retaliate. You can respond. But when nobody sees you, what do you do? Um, I think that the one thing that really sums up my experience through school was in junior high. In my case, it was grade 8, 9, 10. My best friend, we fished together, camped together, played hockey together. Like we did video games, like you name it. After school, go over to his place or he'd come to mine and we'd hang out. We'd hang out all weekend, sleepovers, all the stuff. We went on ski trips with family and, just all the stuff. He could barely say hi to me in school
Why was that?
because he was too busy trying to keep up a reputation as, trying to stay in the in crowd, and too much proximity to me would bring the status down. He would say hi, but he would never hang out with me. But it was always kind of done in a way that I didn't realize what was going on until, many, many years later, that I look back at it. I go, wow, that was cruel.
Do you ever think, like, when you were hanging out after school and on the weekends, like, did you ever have a discussions around, why don't you hang out with me in the schoolyard?
I don't think I had enough self respect to do it. This is the one thing that they don't talk about when, we talk about isolation and being lonely and alone, and is you are so desperate to belong and to have a friend that you would never jeopardize and risk that. And what if you don't like the answer, right?
I wonder if that extends into discussions around mental health and the way we're treating our partners and all those types of things as well. Do you think, now that you're an adult, have you ever been in conversations where you're like, oh, this doesn't sit right with me, but I don't want to jeopardize this friendship given what's happened previously?
I lived that. I mean, I lived that reality, really up until I joined the Brotherhood. So that was only like 3 years ago. I was very manipulative in my relationships before, very. And again, it was that needing to be loved, needing to be needed. But there was this weird, almost like litmus test that I would put them through. It goes like this. And I don't know if this sounds familiar to anybody that, might be listening, but I would test them. I would push them to their absolute breaking point. And that breaking point was a measuring stick to how much they actually loved me or how much they cared for me. They must really love me if they're going to tolerate all of
Mm.
this. And it's born from that idea that you don't deserve friends, you don't deserve people in your life. And when they're there's got to be some kind of mistake. There's got to be a reason for it. So you push it and push it and push it to see, how far you can go.
Mm.
How committed are they really? Needless to say, they all ended not very well. But when I joined the Brotherhood, that was the first time that I got, confronted with it by a group of men, peers, who were able to basically say, like, look, man, you got no boundaries, and boundaries is, as far as I'm concerned, boundaries is the first step in taking some step towards self-respect, right? That's where you
Yeah.
step out of resentment into self-respect.
Did you ever get like help for what was going on? Did you ever go into therapy or try to get some external support to try and work through all the things that you'd been through childhood, through teens, and into your adulthood?
Not back then. Not back then. I didn't. And I remember I always had an excuse. I was a man of many excuses, and I was unhappy for years. But it was always, I'm unhappy because I don't have much money right now.
Hmm.
I'm not happy because I don't have a job or I don't like the job that I'm doing. I'm not happy because I don't have a relationship. I'm not happy because I don't have a social circle, friends, fill in the blank. There was always a reason for me to be unhappy. And those boxes kept changing. So I wasn't seeing the pattern because it was like, well, yeah, I was not happy because I have money, but now I have money, but now I'm not happy because of this. It's a different thing, right? But in
Hmm.
truth, it was all the same. I wasn't happy. I was, and I don't even like to use that term because there's this idea that, we should be happy all the time. It was when I was in a relationship where I was like, this woman is amazing. I've got some money in the bank. I'm happy with where I'm at with my work. Got a bit of a social circle. Like all the things I ticked the box and was like, I've got nothing left to complain about, and I'm still not happy. And that was that light bulb moment where I was like, oh, there's something more going on here. And I remember going to the doctor. That was the first time I ever went to the doctor. He's known me my whole life. And I went in, I was like, I might be depressed. And he's like, well, here, do this test, this written little survey test. And I filled it out. And I remember there's a score at the bottom. And he's like, you are the least depressed person who's ever walked into my
Oh,
clinic
wow.
claiming to be depressed. But I'm very emotional. My emotional regulation is been a big challenge for me. It's something that's I still struggle with. So whatever I'm feeling in the moment is kind of where I'm at. So on the day that I went into the clinic, I was like, yeah, because I'm having a good day. Like, but next week I know that I might not be feeling this way. And then that led me to a psychologist, got a prescription for some antidepressants. And basically I just went on them seasonally because that was really when I was affected was the winter months. So I was on them for 2 years and then I've never been on them since.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about the brotherhood, because you mentioned the brotherhood and finding the brotherhood. Like, what was that like entering the brotherhood? What is it? Is it like an online thing? Is it in person thing? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so it was a local brotherhood here in Vancouver, and they've since expanded out. So they've got little hubs around. They've got an online version, but at the time it was just in person. I think there was over 200 guys all together, and they were divided amongst different what they called squads. So there were generally 10 to 16 people per squad. So there were 15, 16 guys in my squad. It was basically like just kind of like a support group. It's literally the men's circle. We'll sit in a circle. We do a little update on, how our week went, what's going on in our life. And then it's basically a do you want to share further or do you need further support? And on the days that, we didn't have a lot of shares, we would go through some kind of exercise. But that was really just where I was really confronted with the value of being straight with your words, say what you mean what you say, be direct, have boundaries, the value of being on time and respecting time and paying the price if you're not. So yeah, it just really instilled a lot of things that I didn't have in my childhood and or even my work history because most of my work history I was self-employed, so I didn't have that structure. So it really taught me a lot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a really valuable community in itself for you to start exploring some of this inner stuff as well.
Mhm.
Thinking about your journey, like what does having good mental health mean to you now?
That's a tricky question, and it's tricky because in my head I'm like, there's no such thing as good mental health. There's just such a thing as having good mechanisms and good supports and tools that you can use. The mental health is, it can be great one day. Like, you could be somebody who's like, I've never had depression, never had a thing in my life. Like, I'm great. And then the next day you lose everything. So I don't think that you have mental health or don't have mental health. I think it's a spectrum and it's up and down every day, but it's the awareness and the resources and the tools that you have that allow you to thrive and cope,
Mm-hmm.
not even just cope, but even thrive. Right. So even if you're having a bad day, it's that ability to tap into a tool or a resource or people to get through that.
I love that. I kind of reflect on it as a roller coaster ride. Like some days you're up and some days you're down, and
Some days you're leaning over the side, throwing up.
or someone else is throwing up in your face.
Yeah. Those are the real bad days, and what led me to building my community is that when I was in the Brotherhood, and one of the reasons I left the Brotherhood was it has a lot of value. Every squad is different. So every squad has a little bit of a different feel and a different system. For me, it was two things. One was too much and one was too little. And
Mm-hmm.
the too much was this focus on the hyper masculine. There was a lot of the exercises that we would do that were screaming at each other and like
Yeah.
just very like anger based. They weren't all anger based, but it was just a lot of that. It was very hyper masculine, which just felt weird to me. Like one of the exercises would just be like staring at each other eye to eye, straight faced, don't break. I don't get it.
Mm.
Like it just didn't land for me. The other part of it that was too little for me was actual connection. I realized in hindsight again, I had some walls up, so I wasn't really letting people in. But just because of the format and the structure, it just didn't allow enough room for getting to know the person. So me and you were in the same squad. I would know all your shit. I would know all your secrets, all the stuff, all your fears, all the things, but I wouldn't know who Simon is. Like I was only getting that one side of who you are. And I didn't necessarily get to know who you were as a person. And there just wasn't enough room for me for that kind of connection.
Yeah. So what led you to do man becoming, and how did you, I guess, use that experience to create man becoming and work in this space?
I left my squad and I remember telling them that, I wanted to do my own thing. And it was really predicated on the idea that it was going to be much more community based. So it'd be still doing the work, but less focus on the masculine, more focus on life, and more focus on the community aspect of just really getting to know who everybody is and building the relationships that way.
So, like, could you describe for anyone who's like, oh, this sounds really interesting, I'd like to check it out. Like, what happens in your groups? Like, what does it look like?
I mean, in honesty and a little transparency here is I'm just getting started. So we're
Mhm.
just kind of getting it off the ground. It's been a project that I've been talking about and kind of behind the scenes thinking about it for a couple of years. COVID didn't help that, but it's built around personal development. So ideally, the guys who would be interested in this are guys who are mindful. They're into reading books and personal growth, personal development. They're actively pursuing a better life. One of the major disconnects that most people have is, and I totally fell into this category. It's kind of like two categories. One is I was the knowledge seeker, and this comes back to you could say argue it comes back to my schooling where it was just like I just wanted to learn. So I'd read all the books, I'd go to the seminars, I'd see the speakers, I'd do the courses, do the programs, and yet my life wasn't really changing. But I had all the knowledge. I could tell everybody else what to do, but I
Mm.
wasn't seeing the results. But I had the knowledge. And then when I joined the Brotherhood and I hired a coach as well, and I started getting a little more accountability around me, and then things started to change. I started to get better results. I started to see some of the progress. And that's when I realized that we need external accountability, most
Mhm.
of us, to not only move from that state of knowledge into doing, but we also still need that community to go from doing to excelling. Right. So it's kind of, you talked about the Aussie rules, same idea, right?
Mm.
You've kind of got three major players, if you will, that are on your side. You've got a coach who teaches you how to play the game and how to play it better. You've got teammates who hold you accountable and push you and challenge you to grow and be better. And then you have the cheerleaders. And the cheerleaders aren't there just to be like, yeah, you're awesome, but they're actually there to keep you in the game. They don't let you quit. A real cheerleader doesn't let you quit. And that's effectively kind of what the idea of this community is that you can have the support and guidance and learning from a coach with a bunch of teammates who are going to push you and challenge you to grow, all while everybody's cheering you on. Everybody's making sure you stay in the game and reminding you of how great you are, how awesome you
Yeah.
are. Yeah.
It sounds great. Like, yeah, it sounds really cool. And I love this sense of community building and getting away from that. Yeah, I've seen that toxic masculinity, the extreme machoism. Like on my Insta, when I first joined Instagram, I saw these videos of guys screaming at each other. I'm like, I would never do that. That does not interest me whatsoever. But does that mean I'm not a man? Does that mean I'm not masculine? Does it mean I'm more feminine? I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't know. But do I really care at the same time? No, because it's
Yeah.
not me. And it's not, I grew up on a football field hurting my body to get through each game and pushing myself hard and pushing my teammates and vice versa. But it's just not who I am. Like I
Yeah.
was actually the player on the outside of the pack running as fast as he could so I wouldn't get tackled and wouldn't get hurt because internally I was like, I don't want to get bone crunched and bleeding and
Yeah.
all this type of stuff. But and I'd never admit that to anyone. I've only been admitting it more recently, like on the podcast as well. But I'd never admit that growing up. You'd never admit that you wouldn't take a hit for your teammates or whatever. But I like how you really described it. Like in the cheerleader, I just think about a packed Melbourne cricket ground with 100,000 cheerleaders in it,
Yeah.
screaming for their team. We've recently had the AFL Grand Final, so the pinnacle of the season, and yeah, you get about 100,000 people there to, as you're right, cheerleading you and keeping you going, egging you on, not letting you quit because at the end of the day, that victory is what you're all seeking as a collective community working towards that same goal.
Yeah.
I really like that analogy.
I never really experienced that fully until this past spring. I ran the Vancouver Marathon. I ran the half marathon. I was supposed to do the full, and then I didn't train enough, and I was like, I tapped out. I was like, I'm gonna do the half. But it was still, I'd never done a half before. I mean, the longest I'd ever run was about 16K or something like that. And again, like didn't do the full training. I was very ill prepared. The race got off to a massive delay. So they have those energy packs, the gel packs. So we took that. I consumed the whole thing, caffeine, pure sugar, everything. And I'm standing there for 45 minutes waiting for the race to start. Like it was just, by the time it starts, it's like, okay, now I got to pee, just like all the things, right? Because you're like super hydrated because you're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm hydrated. I got the sugar in me. I got the caffeine. I'm ready to go. And then an hour later, you start the race and you're like, well, now I'm coming off.
Yeah.
But I was expecting it to be grueling. I was expecting it to be torturous, not very fun. And the combination, even though I was running it as a solo person, the combination of kind of the teammates, which was all the people that were running with me, I just remember the whole time, like I was cracking jokes the whole run. Like I remember being like 16-kilometer mark and it was like, cracking jokes around like, well, I think I'm warmed up now, just whatever, right? Just trying to like get a reaction from people. But it was the fans, the people on the sidelines, on the sidewalks that I didn't realize how much they can lift you up. None of them had a sign for me. None of them knew me, but just them being there and reading the signs and knowing that, even if it was a sign for somebody, I was like, there was a lot of people that were like, oh, we got wine at the finish line. And I'm like, where can I find you? Like where's the party? I ran that marathon in, I think it was 2 hours, half marathon in 2 hours, 5 minutes. I guaranteed could have run it sub 2 hours, like by far. There was a point where I remember I ran about 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers at around the 17, 18, 19 kilometer mark where I'm running and I'm like, I was breathing at the same level I was if I was walking. It was effortless. The only part of the race that I struggled in was the part that didn't have people. That was it. As soon as I got back into the people, it was like, oh man, this is awesome. So it's so underrated, especially for men, this idea of having people behind us and asking for help and having that support network. And the amount of guys that I talk to, I bring up the idea of like having friends. And they're kind of like, oh, I don't really need friends. And I'm like,
Mm.
wow, you really bought in. Part of the delay in getting this whole community started was I was really not sure where to go because I was very aware of the reality of being a man today. I was very aware of it. I live in what's called the downtown east side. I'm like 3 blocks away from Central. It is the most dense neighborhood, I think, in the world for, or at least in North America, for drugs and homelessness. And, it's incredibly tragic how huge it is. Most of it's men, and I see the men all the time outside where they've been into the heroin and where it literally deforms their body. So they cannot stand upright. They're hinged at the hip. Their back is parallel with the ground, and that's their permanent state. I just see the trauma and the pain and everything that's led them to that point. It's at that point where it's like you cannot think about it too much because it's just too much. And so I was really struggling with the community around where do I build it because I really wanted to build a community of this place of belonging and building friendships, building relationships, having that place of support. But one of the issues that I ran up against was that when you talk about this with guys are like, oh man, that's great. Like we totally need that, just not for me.
Yeah.
And I was last Christmas, like last holidays. I remember getting a message from my buddy's girlfriend, and she was like, "Hey, have you heard from Corey?" And I was like, "No, I haven't heard from Corey." And they're like, "Oh, well, we normally like me and his mom, we hear from him like daily, and we haven't heard from him, so maybe you could reach out." And I was like, "Sure." So I reached out on Messenger, and on the status thing, it's like active 1 hour ago. I was like, "Corey, how you doing, man?" No response. Then I open it up 2 hours later, 4 hours later, go to bed, wake up, no response. Reach out to her. I was like, hey, have you heard from him? And she's like, yeah, he's dead. And he was a guy who had suffered some sexual abuse when he was younger, teenager, at the hands of another guy. Even though they were only a few years apart, he was in some kind of more authoritative position, authority role. And this went on. This went on for apparently a long time. And he only told me this on my birthday a few months earlier.
Mm.
And I think he only told me because he was so drunk that I don't think he even knew what he was saying. And I knew things were kind of falling. Like I could see him like getting worse and worse. And my last message to him was like, hey, let's get together at my place. We'll play some pool, we'll hang out. And I was working a job at the time. And I was so caught up in the idea of being so busy at my job that I never reached out. And then the next thing I know, he's gone. And I remember in that moment, like it was one of the first times that I ever just sat there and just cried. And I cried for like 3 days. Like I just go somewhere, park my car, and just all of a sudden I'd just be like spontaneously just like bawling my eyes out. And it's not that I'm taking responsibility for what happened to him. It was an accidental overdose, is what it was. It was fentanyl. It was laced. It was not a suicide. But I took responsibility for my behavior. I told him like, hey, let's get together. And then I didn't stick to my word.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that he was suffering and I didn't reach out. And I'm not saying that it's going to change the outcome, but in that moment, that was when I was like, I need to create a community. I need to create a space where guys can talk. They can take the mask off and they don't have
Mm.
to hide. And yes, it's around personal development, but personal development starts with self.
So sorry to hear about your mate Corey. They're like shocking, but I think it highlights like how we bottle things up and struggle to open up and talk about things. And how you said that he was so drunk that you don't even know if he knew what he was talking about. And we were talking earlier about starting drinking early, and for a lot of guys, myself included, alcohol was a coping mechanism. in my brain would go a million miles an hour. So I'd often use alcohol as a way to calm things and just feel numb and
Mhm.
not feel pain as well. Like you said that yourself, like you'll go through benders like, 16 those years afterwards as well. Like we're conditioning ourselves at that age and each other through our friendships, but then also it carries on into our adult years as well, and how we cope with things, and I guess this really highlights the importance of some of the work that you're doing with man becoming and men's circles in more broadly, that we can finally have this safe space that is a community that we can start to open up and unpeel this onion that we are, and get right deep into what's really happening, like what's causing us to drink so much, what's causing us to isolate or not have, friendships as well. And be mindful of those things so that we can then be mindful of how we can come out of that as well and grow into the guys that we always wanted to be.
Yeah. And I think that like, and I'm not trained in the mental health field at all, but just from what I've learned and what I've experienced myself, it's so cyclical, which is why it's such a damaging thing.
Mm.
Is that, we're taught when we're young, like you said about, on the playground, like, oh man, you really shouldn't cry. Luckily he knew better.
Mm.
He had somebody in his corner that was like, it's totally okay to express your emotion. But for most boys, we were told, don't do that. And even if we weren't told that, we just knew that it was inherent. You
Yeah.
just don't do it. And then we bottle it up. And then because we bottle it up, we don't learn how to process emotion. And then when an emotion happens and we don't know how to deal with it because we've never learned, we turn to some kind of avoidance. And as far as I'm concerned, most addiction is just avoidance. Obviously, there's chemical addiction, but what leads into that
Yeah.
is avoidance. And I think that like alcohol, I don't know how addicting alcohol, to my knowledge, it's actually not really an addictive substance. That might trigger some people, and I apologize, but it's the numbing that's addicting. It's avoiding that's addicting. And I know that every time that I'm like, oh man, I could really use a drink. Like, even if it's just like not much is going on, but I'm just like, man, I'm going to grab a single tall can on the way home. I have to catch myself and go, what is it that I'm avoiding? What is it
Mm.
that's so uncomfortable in me that I feel like I need to numb it?
And also like putting on a mask, like, so I'm not sure about you, but as I've got older, I've become more introverted, and I think that's the mental health in me telling me I'm not good enough and all this type of stuff. So in order to socialize, I need to drink, put the mask on, and here I go. Now I'm all of a sudden Simon, who's able to have a conversation with someone who I haven't met before. So A, we're numbing it, but also B, it serves as a mask to socialize as well.
And there's another layer to that as well, which is depression. Like, I'm not going to get into the science because I'm not, that's not where I'm at, but I know there is scientific studies showing that, they can be very chemical based. But I also understand inherently that we manifest. And I think that even if there is a chemical imbalance, I think that we can manifest that chemical imbalance. Like, I think that the chemical imbalance is very likely created by ourselves subconsciously
Yeah.
or unconsciously. But one definition that I heard of depression that really landed for me, and I really it really made sense because the depression rates amongst men is huge. It's very high. And this definition basically said that it's a disconnect or a betrayal of self. So from a young age, we're not allowed to express our emotions. So our emotion self is shut off. Then we're told you can't dress like that. You can't play with dolls. You can't do that thing. You can't, figure skating is for girls. So it doesn't matter what it is, right? Anything that wasn't in the hyper masculine category was immediately put into the opposite. It was put into the like, oh, that's girly, that's feminine,
Mhm.
so all of those things get cut off. Even things, something like drama class was feminized, which is ridiculous when you think about it.
A lot of the guys that we look up are these movie stars.
Are you kidding me? Right.
Yeah.
And, but yet they start in drama class and it's like, oh, it's, and the amount of kids and the amount of especially guys that have to choose between drama class and art and sports, because it's like you can't be both. You can be the
Mm.
jock, but you can't be the artist. And peer pressure usually leads to sports. So there's this whole system that creates this betrayal of self. We can't express our emotions. We can't admit that we're suffering and that we're struggling, that we have a problem, because, you know, everybody else has bigger problems than ours. So it's not making light of it. But whether it's women or BIPOC or LGBTQ or a combination of all of those, as a straight white cis male, the response is like, "Are you kidding me? Do you know how good you got it?
Mm.
Like, try stepping into my shoes." And it becomes a competition. And it's my struggles are bigger than your struggles, so your struggles don't count. I think that that is a major problem that we are overlooking. It's a major oversight. So we're cut off from our emotions. We're cut off from acknowledging that we even have a problem in the first place. We're cut off from expression unless it fits the hyper masculine, which I don't think a lot of guys naturally fall into. I think it's just a lot of peer pressure that the
Mm.
guys go that way. You know, and then there's like the expectations around women, especially when you become a teenager, that, you know, you're supposed to be a horn dog. You're supposed to be, you know, wanting to be with all the girls. And, you know, and for a lot of guys, it's not true. It's just not a big deal to them, but they have
Mm.
to, again, put on that mask. And you can see how it just builds this whole cycle of betrayal of self. You can't express yourself emotionally. You can't express yourself artistically. You can't express yourself with where you're at and what you're going through. You have to dress a certain way. You have to have a certain kind of job. You have to make a certain kind of money. Like, it just goes round and round and round. And then we wonder why we have, you know, male suicide rates as high as they are. Well,
Mm.
suicide is ultimately reaching that dead end road, going, there's nowhere else for me to go. And it's the boxes that we've been put into that creates that dead end. But in truth, there is no dead end. There's an infinite possibilities, but because we put in such a small box, and then we have to live up to this box. And we realize somewhere along the lines that whether we are aware of it or not, depression is the symptom of, I'm in a box that I don't belong in. This isn't who I am. I'm not living my own life. You know, and for any guy out there or just person out there who's been, you know, whether it's trans or you know, if they're gay, that idea of, you know, coming out. Some guys, you know, like a lot of guys don't come out until they're well into their 30s and even 40s. All those years that they lived in betrayal to themselves, they were very aware of it, but they couldn't tell the world. So they had to pretend that they were somebody else. And it's no wonder that the depression rates are also high. And then all of that lends itself back to that avoiding that feeling and the addiction. And I want to be clear, the addiction doesn't have to be alcohol. It doesn't have to be substance. It can be sex. It can be porn. It can be work, right? It can be the gym. Anything that we go to obsessively when we start feeling uncomfortable, and that's the thing that we go to, it's not necessarily a healthy, even if it's the gym, it's not necessarily a healthy thing. It's a trauma response. It's an addiction, and it's an addiction based on avoidance.
Yeah. So some of the things you're talking about, or a lot of the stuff you're talking about, it reminds me of patriarchy and this role that patriarchy has in our society. And I know you're interested in male patriarchal psychology. So is this
Yes,
leaning into that? Like, can you tell us a bit about that, your interest in that? And is this what you're talking about when you're talking about putting ourselves in all these boxes and not allowing ourselves to jump out of them?
that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. And you know, for any guys listening, there's a book that I highly recommend listening to or reading. It's by Bell Hooks. She was a feminist, and she passed away just, I think, a couple of years ago, sadly. But she wrote a book called The Will to Change. And I'd been talking about, you know, the social constructs or the social contracts that men live by. And when I listened to her book, I was like, oh my God, she gave me the language to understand what I was talking about. She was saying the same things, just she had the language around it. Like, I'd never heard of male patriarchal psychology
Mm.
until she said it. And it's exactly that. It's the men must be the breadwinners. The men have to be strong and tough, because otherwise you're just not a man. You have to have, you know, there's this idea of you have to be put together. You have to have all the answers. You have to be like a sexual god. Otherwise you're not worthy, and you have to be athletic, and you have to be into manly things, you have to be into cars and motors and sports and fighting, and it's all of these rules. But most importantly, it's the detachment from self, which is the you're not allowed to feel emotions, you're not allowed to acknowledge that you struggle, you're not allowed to do the things that aren't super masculine. And what it does is, and I love her description of patriarchy, it's to divide and control. And with those same communities that I was just talking about, with women, BIPOC, LGBTQ, it's very easy to see how it's divided and controlled. Very easy to see it. With men, we don't see it. And I think that there's this illusion, there's this misnomer that men are the patriarchy because they've got all the advantages. So they must be the patriarchy. But the truth is that we are the sons and daughters of the patriarchy. We are not the father of it. We are the sons of it. And the divide and control isn't external. It's in here and in here where we get divided from ourself. And when we're divided from ourself, it's really easy to send us to a factory to go and work. It's, and be away from the family. It's easy to separate us in war and send us off to war. Right. So it was a necessary tool for the machine to be able to control the male population, to get them to do what they need to do. And how do you send somebody off to war to go and kill somebody that they don't even know?
Mm.
You got to be pretty detached from who you are.
Yeah, it got me thinking about some of the things that I see in the dad space. I'm a dad myself, and I follow a lot of dads on socials as well. And this concept around new age parenting and the new dad. I read an article about the new dad, which is actively trying to, I guess, move away from that traditional sense of, what we grew up as kids in terms of how we can raise our boys, particularly. And like, say, for example, my son, one week he wants to do football, the next week he wants to do choir and or dance, and next week could be ninja classes. He's all over the place. It's hard to keep up actually. But from a dad's perspective, a new age dad perspective, I'm like, yeah, man. Like if you want to go and dance and sing, and he's got some killer moves on the dance floor, that's cool. And then I also think about career choices because at a young age, we're also like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then we start pushing people down certain lines. But
Yeah.
I think back to my career before I became a social worker, I kind of fell into that safe box and I thought, I actually wanted to be an artist. And I'm like, well, I don't know how to make money out of that. So I'm going to go this safe option
Yeah.
that's going to give me a desk job and 9 to 5 job or whatever. But for my son Gus and my daughter Pippa, when they get to that age, I'll be like, you just follow whatever lights you up and makes you bounce out of bed because at the end of the day, as long as you're happy, then I'm happy. Money is important, but also you learn to live within the means. If you're not making millions of dollars, that's okay. And so thinking about my growing up and my young adulthood and my adulthood, and then projecting and going, okay, or reflecting, not so much projecting, because I guess patriarchy is projecting,
Yeah.
but reflecting and go, okay, well, this is the things that I didn't like growing up, and this is also the things that I would have liked growing up. Let's our kids just explore life themselves and figure out their own path, and we'll just guide them along the way
Mhm.
as best as we can, as gently as we can, but also trying not to be the helicopter parent as well. And I think there's a lot of guys in this space, like yourself included, and dads particularly, that are just like, yeah, like let's really embrace the kids and being kids, and also we can get a lot of value from how they see the world, and also challenge the way we see the world through their eyes as well. What's some things that, thinking about your knowledge around patriarchal psychology and your growing up, and where you think you're going to go in the future? What's some things that guys can do to kind of challenge those traditional constructs?
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking about, like, I'm not a father, not yet, anyways, but talking about the patriarchal system. One of the things that we as men, and as for those that are fathers, that I think that needs to be reclaimed is that being a father is a caretaker. It is a role. And we need to do away with the idea of I'm the father, I'm the provider, because that's one more way that we are divided. And all you have to do is look at the courts, right? courts automatically, and this is global, courts automatically favor the woman because
Mhm.
she's naturally predisposed to be a better parent because she's a woman. So fathers are more likely to lose full custody of their kids, but they're also the ones that are on the hook to pay the bills.
Mm.
So you can literally be paying a financial cost to raise kids that you are not even allowed to see. And that, you want to talk about divide and control, that's it in a spotlight. So I think that, just the language that we use and being aware of that. So as a father, my idea would be like, I am a caretaker, I am the father, I do all the same things that mom does except breastfeed. Right, and claiming it, and claiming it with pride, and not hiding behind it, because a lot of times that guys get shamed for it.
Mm.
Like,
Mm.
oh, you're a stay-at-home dad, ooh, like while your wife is out making the money, or you know what I mean, like it's such a shameful situation. It's shaming and shameful. But I think that, one of the things that I'm learning, and it's not easy. I'm 42. It's been 42 years of being put in a box. So it's not easy, but start to just own little bits and pieces of what it is that you secretly enjoyed. So, if you think back to childhood, like, what was it that you did that lit you up? What was it you could
Mm.
do for hours? And is there a way that you can do that now? It might look different now, but is there a way that you can do that now? And just try and find a little bit of time to do it, or whatever. Maybe it's personal expression. I love bright colors, right? So it's, for me, it's just like, I'm going to wear bright colors. And I've been contemplating, and now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, maybe what I'm going to do is, the idea of, I like music festivals. So like, maybe the next festival I go to, I'm going to paint my nails yellow because I love yellow, and just use that. And maybe that's the first step, is, the festival is the safe space.
Yeah.
So I can go and paint my nails. And then maybe it goes beyond that. Maybe it's like, oh, I really like this. And it doesn't have to be feminine, but it just has to be something that, and I don't even like the masculine feminine. It's just an expression. Whatever that thing is that you've buried, that little bit of yourself, just start taking ownership of it, just little by little. And I think that's the best way out of it. And it doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't matter how silly it is.
I love that because I was talking to another podcast guest, April Likens, a few weeks back, and around burnout, and we were talking about rediscovering joy as a self care practice and a way to look after ourselves. And we often are very joyful in childhood, like we find those things that really light us up. If it's camping, fishing, video games, music, whatever, dance, whatever it is. But then as
Yeah.
we become adults and we have to adult
Yeah.
and we lose track of that joy, and we kind of bury ourselves in what our roles as you said, providers instead of caregivers, and all that type of stuff. But finding joy is something that it does light us up and it makes us feel
Yeah.
good. And if you've got kids, if you don't know how to find joy, just go and find their joy, because they do some
Yeah.
weird and wonderful things. Like we play a lot of hide and seek at the moment. It's just, you wouldn't believe how many times I've counted to 10 in the last few weeks,
Yeah.
and then find my kids around in the same spot in the house, but they love it. And it's so
Yeah.
much fun just hearing them laugh, just
Yeah.
something simple like that.
And here's another thing too, is it doesn't even have to be from childhood. It's just like, what's
Mm.
that thing that, maybe publicly you feel maybe shame or embarrassed, but what's something that you can do for you? And, it's funny because I'm in a condo building, and I'm facing, I see like all of downtown from my place. So it's like, I can see everything. And there's times where at night, as like, I'll have my blinds up, so windows are fully open, and I'll just turn some music on, and I literally for like 45 minutes, I'll just like dance. Something that it's something that I've always been very self-conscious of. One, because I'm not good. Two is I'm rather tall. And as a tall guy, there's a reason why so many tall guys slouch, because they just want to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a bar or you're in a place where you're dancing, you can see everybody. It means everybody can see you.
Mm.
So you can't just dance and blend in. It feels like you're on it's the same feeling as if you were dancing on a stage. So for me, like, one of those things is just like, dance like nobody's watching.
Yeah.
And I can do that in my own place. And it can be my secret. Nobody needs to know about it. But it's one of those things that I look like a fool. I suck at dancing, awkward as hell, but it brings me joy. Like it makes me feel good. And that would be my big thing is like, and you talk about being a father, and it's especially true for fathers, is stop putting yourself last.
Yeah.
We tend to have a priority list, and our name is never on it.
Or at least below the dog.
Yeah. And it's that idea that, well, first I need to take care of the paycheck. Then I need to make sure the wife is okay. Then I need to make sure the kid's okay. Then I got to make sure the dog is okay. Then I got to make sure the house is okay. And before you get through your checklist of all the things that got to be okay, you've run out a day. Yeah. And then you run out a week, and you run out a month, and you run out a year. And I think that men need to start, women do it really, really well, of just taking those moments where it's like, I'm going to have me time. Yep. And for them, it might be just the candlelit bath, or whatever. And I think that guys need to start doing that as well.
I love that. That's really good advice.
We cannot live healthily on a hamster wheel that has no end. We have to get off of it once in a while and just be like, hey, self-care time. Maybe it is a bath. I don't know. Maybe it's a hot tub. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's like, it's important that we do it. And definitely. I just don't think that guys stop long enough to put their name on the list.
Kyle, I'm having such an amazing chat, but I recognize that we could probably go for the rest of the day.
Oh, I'm sure.
2 more questions and I'll let you go. And yeah. The first one, if people do want to find you, like what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So right now I'm just setting everything up. So it's not, like I said, it's just getting going. So you should be able to just Google Man Becoming. Yep. And hopefully that'll show up. Otherwise it's just my name on most things.
Yeah, cool. So, and it does show up. I was Googling it before. Yeah. So yeah, we'll definitely put the links in the show notes. But the last question is, and we just talked about your dancing, but plug something that makes you feel good. So it doesn't have to be anything to do with mental health or patriarchy or whatever. But yeah, what's something other than your dancing, unless you really want to plug your dancing again, that makes you feel good?
For me, it's, and this is clearly why I've ended up where I've ended up with what I'm doing, but also why I've struggled a lot, is it's people. I really enjoy being around people. I enjoy conversations like this. I know this is podcast style, but if this wasn't a podcast, we'd be having the same conversation. Hosting events, bringing people together. That's really what it is. It's bringing people together, getting to know who they are, and just conversations like this. That's really, I could do this all day, every day.
Yeah, and I guess that's that stuff that comes into Man Becoming, is creating that community for guys to come and connect and learn more about each other than just one side of their personalities and what's going on as well.
I remember one of the questions that somebody had asked me. They said, why Man Becoming and why you? And the answer to the why you part was because I'm willing to go where most men aren't. I'm willing to step into that vulnerability to open that space up for other men to come into, whereas most men just are not willing to, first, they're not willing to go first if they're willing to go at all. So I think that's a big part of it.
Well, Kyle, thanks so much again for your time. This has been a really great, in-depth, vulnerable chat, and I really appreciate you opening up about your story and sharing it with us today.
I'm so happy to be here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure that you like it and leave a comment, and then share it with your mates. Also, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a moment of future episodes to come.